This lecture covers the first part of Chapter 13, the respiratory system. It'll give a generalized overview as well as covering the upper respiratory tract. So the pulmonary system is responsible for bringing oxygen in from the atmosphere and to remove the waste product of carbon dioxide through exhalation. And it's important to distinguish between ventilation versus respiration. So the predominant gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen, and it makes up about 78% of the gas in the atmosphere. It's inert, which means our body does not utilize it. The next predominant gas is oxygen, which accounts for about 20.98%, and it's very important for cellular metabolism. So it's the final electron acceptor in the final electron transport chain whenever we're converting glucose into ATP. So ventilation refers to the movement of air into and out of the lungs. So this brings gas into the lungs and it removes carbon dioxide by exhalation. Respiration is the exchange of gases in which oxygen enters the bloodstream and carbon dioxide is removed. So respiration actually refers to the actual diffusion of the gases across the alveolar capillary membrane. So ventilation is, again, movement of gas into and out of the lungs. External respiration is the exchange of gases across the alveoli to the pulmonary capillaries. So this is the body actually interacting with the external environment as we draw that gas into our lungs. Internal respiration refers to the exchange of gas from capillaries to the tissues within the body. So once the gases are already dissolved in the bloodstream, when they're diffusing into the cells themselves, that's internal respiration. And our oxygen reserve in our body lasts only about 4 to 6 minutes. So if you're unable to ventilate or respirate, you will actually start suffering tissue cell death at about 4 to 6 minutes. So the upper respiratory tract starts at the nose and ends at the vocal cords. It has several functions, including heating and cooling the incoming gases, filtering particles from the gases, humidifying incoming air to roughly 80%. It provides a sense of smell or olfaction. It also helps with phonation, which is speech. And it ventilates the gas. It's a conduit for the gas to reach the lower airways. The nose is a semi-rigid structure made out of cartilage and bone. The nasal cavity is the space behind the nose, and it has 3 regions. The vestibular region is just inside the nostrils. It contains hair, which is covered in sebum, and these hairs sort of filter the particles as it comes in through the atmospheric gas. The olfactory region is in the roof of the nasal cavity, and it contains the first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve, and this assists with smelling. And then the respiratory portion. So despite being called the respiratory portion, no gas exchange happens here. But it does contain your nasal turbinates, which adds surface area to your nasal passages to help with adding moisture to gas as it enters into the nasal passage. So cells which line the respiratory tract are pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So they're column-shaped cells of different heights, which gives the appearance of it being stratified or layered, but in fact, it's actually one layer. So that's why they call it pseudostratified. Cilia are hair-like appendages which come up out of the cell, and they can beat in a sequential way, kind of like people doing the wave at a basketball game, and that sequential beating of the cilia can actually mobilize secretions and move them out of the airways. Goblet cells and submucosal cells produce mucus in 2 layers. The first is a sole layer, which is a very watery sort of substance that lays right on top of the cilia, and then on top of that is the gel layer, which is a thicker layer of mucus. And mucus is a sticky layer which traps debris, foreign particles, pathogens, etc. And then the cilia then are able to sort of do that sequential wave and move the mucus out of the respiratory tract. Sinuses are air-filled cavities which connect with the nasal cavity through ducts. They are also lined with respiratory mucosa, so they're capable of producing mucus. Each of them are named for the facial bones in which they reside. So the frontal sinuses are in the frontal bone, the maxillary sinuses are in the maxillary bones, etc. The purpose of the sinuses is to help in phonation, help in speech, but they also keep our heads lighter, as lighter than they would be had the bone been solid. And sinuses are actually absent at birth. They don't start to form until 6 months to 2 years of age. So the pharynx is a common passageway for both air and food. It begins just behind the nasal cavity and is divided into 3 parts. The nasopharynx is just posterior to the nasal cavity. It contains lymphatic tissue called adenoids. And it also contains the opening of the eustachian tube, so the tubes that drain your ears empty into the nasopharynx. The oropharynx is just behind the oral cavity. It contains lymphoid tissue, the palatine, and the lingual tonsils. And then the laryngopharynx is in the lower portion of the pharynx, and it opens into either the esophagus or into the trachea. So the larynx is just below the laryngopharynx. It is composed of rigid cartilage, and there is thyroid cartilage, which is what we usually refer to as the Adam's apple. There's also the cricoid cartilage, which is just below the thyroid cartilage. And then the glottis is this space between the vocal cords. The epiglottis, epi meaning above, is a flap of tissue which, whenever we swallow food or swallow secretions, it sort of is kind of like a trash can lid that falls over the airway, so that as we're swallowing solids and liquid particles, it doesn't get into the airway. The vocal cords divide the upper and lower respiratory systems, and vibration of the vocal cords is what's responsible for sound production.